All right, so you already said the title. That's me. Um, so what I'm going to try to explain and talk about is how speaking in tongues or studying speaking in tongues expands our thinking about ego dissolution. And when I say our, I'm thinking about people involved in mindfulness studies and psychedelic research. Basically, the sort of whole renaissance of contemplative and psychedelic work that's going on right now. Um, Partly because when you think about speaking in tongues, the phenomenology is very similar to things like psychedelics. There's this experience of renewal. We'll talk about that. There's an experience of awe or an emotional release. There's an experience of decentering the self, of sensory experience that are unusual. Some people would call them hallucinations. And there's also actually a really similar history of it being dismissed by the world of research. But there's really different expectations, different imaginations, different forms of culture that shape this whole thing. And a big piece of this argument is that um, set and setting are a lot more than valence. And I think that's part of what you'll see when we go through this piece. And so I should be able to go to the next one. All right, okay. So this is stuff you're familiar with. I'm going to do it really quick, which is basically, so ego dissolution. It's the big concept right now that people are working with in research on psychedelics. Um, and it's considered, the key predictor of all these health benefits. It's often tied to the mystical experience. I know there was a study last, 2 weeks ago that said maybe not, but uh, it's been a central concept is that dissolving the self in some way, and there's all sorts of questions about what the self is key to the health effects of psychedelics. And this story you're all familiar, right, is that if you're dissolving the self and then you're able to build something different. The patterns that you've had, the priors, get loosened, and people are able to think differently and get outside of their depressive patterns, their traumatic patterns. This is where the therapeutic concept comes, right? Um, but one of the questions that is true has been true in religious studies forever, really, and in a bunch of research about this kind of stuff um, is one ego dissolution the same as another? And what can you learn when you think about different types? So in when you study religion, they talk about this as the perennialism question. Is Christianity the same as Hinduism? Is it the same as Buddhism? Or are these all really just fundamentally the same thing with slightly different sort of cultural veneers, or are they fundamentally different? Um, and we'll look at that a bit. We're not going to answer that question, obviously, but can think a little bit about how the veneer of culture or the shaping of culture actually gets deep into the body and is not just a veneer. That's what my argument's going to be. So what's happening right now, and you're all aware of this, is that all over the world, people are very excited about non-duality, ego dissolution, and its relationship to psychedelics and meditation. And there's hundreds of papers coming out that are thinking, okay, well, how do we understand this? What is this thing? And so I'm talking right into the center of that conversation, thinking with folks who are, looking at the non-dual awareness dimensional assessment trait, right? The non-dual awareness, the NADA scales. There's all these scales coming out that are essentially trying to say, okay, this is what ego dissolution looks like. This is what ego dissolution looks like. And we're working with these. My point is basically this is a conversation that's happening. There's some really interesting work, the work on the ego dissolution inventory that's being used in a bunch of different studies right now shows important things, that people are changing, that they are shifting something that they call the sense of self. And we're not going to get into too much detail about all the pieces of that, but just to show you it's happening. And then there's this other part of the conversation that's saying, wait a second, and David Dupuy and Samuel's work is really useful for this, because they're among a bunch of people who are anthropologists, but also working with psychedelics, and are saying, wait a second, there's culture, there's context, there's a whole lot of other stuff that affects the way that people work with their minds in psychedelics. So this paper is an interesting one because it's like, is it really just super placebo? And placebo some ways sounds like a denigration, but if you think about it from an anthropological perspective, placebo is just a way that people use their minds and their cultures to have an effect on their bodies. Okay, so what I'm talking about and the world that I'm looking at is charismatic Christians. And charismatic Christians, or some people call them Pentecostal, that was sort of a part of the movement anyways. It's a huge movement, and it's hard to understand how big it is because most people who are not charismatic don't encounter it very often. But charismatic Christianity, the way it's formed right now, most people would say it started either 1900 or 1906, and with a couple thousand people, and we're talking about something like 500 million people today around the world, and it's in all, like, every country you could go to. There's huge groups of people doing this, and I'll tell you more about it. But it's been pretty much ignored, which is interesting. It's been ignored in the world of psychology, or ignored or denigrated, really. There's two big reasons for that. One is that there were studies in the 1970s that basically said this is pretend. So what people are doing here is just performing for each other. And Samarin and Spanos both showed that, well, Spanos especially, but Samarin showed that it was not a trance, like that you don't have to go into an altered state to be able to speak in tongues. And then Spanos showed that you could pretend to speak in tongues, and it looks just like speaking in tongues, and most people think it is. And so they basically said, this is social signaling, story's over, it's not a big deal. At the same time, actually, excuse me, there were a group of researchers, Erica Borg-Young and Felicitas Goodman especially, who were saying, oh, look at this kind of altered states practices, these practices that generate altered states. We're noticing them all around the world. We're noticing them in Europe. We're noticing them in the US. We're noticing them throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America. And we think they're differently formed by social structures, but we think this is a pretty broad, universal form of behavior. And Goodman essentially said, not only is it universal, but it's really healthy. And her argument was that there's a flexibility in the mind, which you will find probably a familiar argument. Funny thing is that other people were saying, yes, it's a flexibility in the mind, and it makes people socially deviant. So there were studies that said people who are speaking in tongues are, schizotypal, narcissistic, and just generally unhealthy in a whole bunch of ways. And so one of the reasons that it's been ignored is that evangelicals are like, stop studying us, don't come in. Like, we really don't want people to debunk and say this is pretend, and we don't want people to be writing papers telling us that we're crazy. And so for several decades, there was very little research on this. Another reason that has been ignored is that it's really tied closely to pretty intense right-wing politics. And that's an interesting thing too, because that's not always been true. So when the movement emerges in 1900, 1906, there's a church in Los Angeles. It's called the Azusa Street Revival. And William Seymour, who is African-American preacher, basically says it's time for people to start feeling God in their bodies in these important ways. And hundreds of people are having these wild experiences, which I'll talk about a bit. And it's very exciting, and people from all over the world come to Los Angeles to see it, to make fun of it, to learn it, to take it around the world. And it spreads like wildfire, like all over the world. People begin to have these experiences in much more systematic ways because they feel like it's the time. This movement was pacifist. They were environmentalists. There were women leaders. It was multiracial. It was, there were groups of people that were saying marriage is a problem. So what was happening is that they were having experiences that put them outside of the normal thought modes. They were thinking differently from their worship experiences, and then they were challenging social structures all over. That sounds a lot like what people think psychedelics could do, right? There's absolutely this idea that when when you're changing your mind, you can think differently, you can think outside the box, and it allows for certain kinds of creativity and new social possibility. And I'm sure you've all encountered that. Well, the Pentecostals in 1906 in Azusa were experiencing that. Those movements changed and shifted. And so the sort of sense of rebellion, which was against the state and against racism and against militarism. I mean, these guys were pacifists for the most part until the 1970s, until the Vietnam War. The rebellion against these structures shifted, and that's a whole nother story, but throughout the 1930s and 40s and 50s, so that now, for the most part, these churches see themselves as rebels against modernity, against what they see as hypersexuality, what they see as Hollywood, wokeness. It's become a right-wing rebellion, but has some of the same flavor as the left-wing rebellion before. That was really part of what they were doing. So let me tell you a little bit about what the practice is. So when people, I mean, these are evangelicals, which means that they're born again, right? They see themselves as having moments of rebirth. And this is a really important concept because it's not just dissolving the self, it's the self being born again, dissolving and coming back. So integration becomes a really big question when you're thinking about this kind of work. They also, they believe in Jesus. They believe in a relatively literal interpretation of the Bible. They believe in activism, meaning that they tend to think that their experience is so important they need to share it with other people, and that those people should take them really seriously and convert. And then they do what's called the gifts of the Spirit, and the gifts of the Spirit include being explained in the Spirit, where people fall down in what looks like a kind of trance experience. The one that I'm going to talk about most is speaking in tongues, and speaking in tongues is a prayer practice where people say words that sound to most of us like nonsense words. And there's been endless debate about what exactly the words are. There's been no social scientists who've been able to show that there's any actual semantic structure to it. So my basic sense is it's mostly nonsense. There's also dozens and dozens of stories where someone will be speaking in tongues, and then someone else will be like, wait, that's French, or that's Russian, or although it hasn't been verified. For my purposes and for the purposes of this research right here, it doesn't really matter. We'll call it nonsense words because that's what it is mostly. But what it's experienced as by the people who are doing it is a powerful release of control. They're letting the words come out. And when you interview them, and I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews with people about their experience of speaking in tongues. Many of them will pretend at first. They will try, they'll just say nonsense words until at some point they feel like they've given up control. They feel like God comes on and takes over, and the words just start coming. And when they become skilled like that, it's something that they can do at will. And we had people doing this in the MRI, in lots of different difficult situations, so they can bring it on. So we're going to talk about speaking in tongues a bunch. And one of the things that I think is especially interesting about this is that it's a passionate form of contemplation, right? It's a high arousal. It's fierce. There's an intensity. It's like the kind of work that, it's like what it feels like to surf or climb a mountain. I think people describe that often. And that's partly what happens at the end, but it's partly what happens at the beginning too, because people are looking to God with a passionate attention. They're letting their voices release. They feel this kind of high arousal experience, and then it drops and things become silent and their mind becomes relaxed. And that's when they listen closely for the voice of God. And it's when they hear voices, when they feel touches, when they have those sensory override experiences that are very similar to what people experience when they're having psychedelic experiences. One thing I think is really fun is that passion, right, has this piece of passivity, which I hadn't really thought about it before. But so passion is like intensity, but it's also letting go, and that's true in the language back for many, many decades. So it's an interesting concept. All right. So this study, I interviewed 35 charismatics. These were like these 4 to 6 hour interviews. People call them microphenomenological. And then there was a specific 1 hour interview after they did the MRIs. This is a neurophenomenology, which means it's front loaded. Like you front load your neuroscience with certain cultural learnings. And this is literally front loaded with ethnography for 5 years in the same denomination. So that means for 5 years, I was visiting and hanging out and spending time with people before we said, hey, can we study this with neuroscience? That would be really interesting. And we designed the study together. So when you think about community-based participatory research, this was a conversation where I sat down with people and said, so what is your experience? What do we need to learn about it? I know what I'm bringing, right? And I know what I'm learning. So let's do the neurophysiology of it. This talk today, I'm not going to get to that very much because the data is just being analyzed. But this is what one of the churches looks like. This is sort of the main church that we're in. And it's the Glad Tidings Church in San Francisco. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you 2 stories about ego-dissolution. It's 2 people's stories. When we did these extended interviews, we really learned a lot, and you could see they're not using the words ego-dissolution, but we'll see if you would agree that this is the same kind of thing that we're dealing with. So here's a story. Pablo grew up in an African-American neighborhood in San Francisco, and he spent his summers with his grandma in Merced, which is a small town in the Central Valley of California. And there he went to a church 5 mornings a week. His grandma, he's very Christian. This was important to him. But his grandma dies when he's 11. He gets furious. He's furious with God. He throws grocery carts off highway bridges and starts fighting on the street. And he's like an amazing boxer because his uncle's like a champion boxer. So he ends up like in all these fights. But he's also this super driven kid. So he's getting straight A's coming out of a really poor neighborhood, and he ends up at UC Berkeley, which is unusual for kids from his neighborhood. And on a weekend when he's home from Berkeley, this is the Clinton era. So in the United States, there were these police sweeps that were running through neighborhoods, especially Black neighborhoods, where they would check kids for drugs. And so he's playing basketball with some friends. They sweep the neighborhood. One of the kids has marijuana, but the kid is 17 and Pablo's 18. So he's the only one they can arrest and charge in any serious way. So they pick him. And he's dealing with this situation. He's about to go to court. The day of court, something magical happens, or that's how he tells it. Actually, he wouldn't call it magical. He would say it was from God. So something really, really amazing happens, which is that the judge calls him in early, and he says, I don't understand who you are. You're like this inner city kid, and yet you have 60 character witnesses saying you're just amazing and driven and capable and ought not to be, in prison. And then this morning, the police who arrested you all got busted for cocaine. So I want to give you a deal, right? I want to let you off. I'll give you a month of community service, and then you'll be fine. So this was a miracle. It was a miracle, but also Pablo was so stubborn and so furious with the state that he said, no, I'm not taking that. And he went to prison for a month. I'm trying to give you a sense of this person. So then he goes to Los Angeles, becomes a music producer, is a music producer for like major music stars. I mean, Michael Jackson, actually. So he's absolutely deeply successful. Then he meets a gospel singer, falls in love with her, and she brings him back to the church. And he's like, can I do this? Can I be part of this church? Because it's really about letting go of my future and the things that happened to me, like my dreams for myself. And I've already shown you that he's kind of an intense person, but he says what happened to him, what shifted him was physical experience. He started worshiping and his body started to shift. So he tells me the story. One day in worship, he says, I was being pressed down. I first started to try to get up, and it was like, no, I couldn't move. And usually I like to be in control. So he let himself flop, and his body got hot. He said, my body was just hot. Have you ever seen how an iron rod, when it's put in the fire, it turns blue? I felt that my body was hot all over. And then I started speaking in a different language. And that was him speaking in tongues, right? And so what he says is, when he was speaking in tongues, he stopped feeling like he had a stable self. And he used that word. He said, now I'm no longer at a stable place. I'm on a ground I'm not used to walking on. I used to want to be on a foundation I can control, but I'm in a place that's unfamiliar. And it takes time for that burning and molding and cooling, that heating that happens when I'm speaking in tongues. But I don't think you become solid. So he talks about how he gets lost and it tears his self apart and it's loosened. And then in the end, the prayer helps him feel quite powerful. So he says, like, I was a superhero. It feels like metal in my veins, almost like the X-Men. I can't even explain it. It's almost like I'm having too much energy in my body. So that's Pablo's story. Another story, and this one I'm going to give a little bit of a trigger warning. It's got some violence in it, sexual violence. Andorra. So I meet this woman. She's probably 5'2", like a small, heavy-set grandma, I think in her mid-60s, and she's walking to church with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. Like just a scene that's hard to think critically of. It just looks sort of beautiful. And the only thing that gave me any signal about her history was that she had tattoos all up her neck and her back. And so she told me the story. She had grown up in a brothel. Her mom was a prostitute there. When she was 6 years old, her uncle forced himself on her. And in that moment, she heard a voice. And the voice said, you're going to be okay. So that capacity to dissociate, I think, would be a term that, some people might use to describe what's going on. But to hear a voice that to her felt like a voice from outside of her head, and to have that voice be something that helps her, that calms her, that keeps her together, became a tool for her for the rest of her life. And she had a really hard life. She became the leader of a gang. She was a prostitute. She killed people. It was a very rough sort of street experience. And throughout that, there was this voice that happened. And then at some point, she learned that she could speak back to that voice. And for her, it was the voice of God. And when she started to speak, sometimes it came out as nonsense. And she said, I feel like I lose me. I feel like I'm with him. I'm out of my own place. His is a safe place, a place where I can let go. I can't really explain it. No one else can go there. And so her body was something different. She said, I've sold my body. I've put drugs in it. I've let anybody use it. I've let gangs use it. I've let them tattoo me. I don't care about this body. But I have this connection to God. And in the end, her connection to God inspired a form of power and release that really sent her airborne. She says like this, when I'm praying, I feel like I'm free. I feel like I'm flying. I don't have that pull in me. I'm not who I was at all. I'm what he's made me. I'm just flying. It takes me into the air. I visualize a dove just gone or a butterfly just going. So I'm going to tell you one more story. And this one is about decentering. So when I talk with people who are speaking in tongues, one of the things that they often do when they're speaking in tongues is they take an emotional challenge or difficulty and they imagine that they're handing it to God. So it's the kind of thing where they like literally will say, okay, I'm feeling horrible about something. I'm feeling horrible about how I treated my child the other day, and I want to be released from that. So I'm going to give this to God. And I think that's an interesting example of an evangelical version of decentering. So back to the science a little bit. People talk about self-transcendence as evoked by upward spirals of decentering. There's some really interesting studies that show that the more you take yourself out of the story, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ego dissolution, or at least it's a part of it. And I'm curious if this decentering is similar to the evangelical decentering that I'm describing. There's also, and we'll talk about this more, but when you think about the self in evangelical practice and the way that they're letting go of their self, it's not, and it's not dissolving into the ocean. It's not the oceanic dissolving that we've heard a lot about. It's dissolving into one being. They're seeing God and they're saying, I melt with God. And really, actually, I in all these interviews at the end, I would say, so tell me, are you melting yourself? Is your ego dissolving? And I'd use the mystical experiences scale and ask a bunch of questions. And every time they're like, no, we are not losing ourselves. We are merging. We're not mystics. And so it's a really interesting blend of an experience of release and an experience of ego dissolution and a conceptual frame that keeps it within a relationship to God. And I'll explain the significance of that in a minute. This is a diagram that Jonas Mago, who's a neuroscientist at McGill drew, and I really love it. So I wanted to show you part of what we think is happening. So when you're speaking in tongues, you're filling the mind with God, right? It's passionate. You focus intensely on God, on God, on God, on God, and you're making this noise. And what seems to happen is that it gets easier and easier and easier. You become attracted to it. It becomes appealing. And our suspicion is that part of that appeal is the arousal that happens because it feels really good. There's a bliss going on. There's an awe. And in that attraction, there's then a loosening and a release of effort. So I think this is the process that we're talking about. I think also there's some empowerment stuff going on, but I think the bigger picture, here's sort of my closing, putting things together here, is that speaking in tongues expands our thinking about ego dissolution, right? When you think about culture, so speaking in tongues and evangelical practice is about being born again. And that means that we're not just dissolving, but over time we're reintegrating. And that needs to be a focus, I think, in thinking about how this is healing and how this works for people. Like, what is reintegration like? And is the goal dissolution, or is the goal a new self? And I think it's a really good question because I kind of love the idea of dissolving the self. But another piece of it is that the awe that people are experiencing. So anybody who's looked at Dacher Keltner's work, he's the PI at Berkeley that I work most closely with. He's looking at awe, AWE, as an important sort of physiological and social experience of release and loosening and of feeling small, the small self. That's absolutely part of what's going on when people are speaking in tongues. God to them is really, really big. And really important in that way. And actually, I've run into some people who experience something like speaking in tongues just from sort of nature, from the scale of awe that they're experiencing there. So awe seems an important piece. And there's absolutely emotional arousal, which makes you wonder, like, what's the heat that's going on in their bodies? Is heat part of what's loosening? Makes you think of a sauna, right? Like, is that what's loosening the mind? But at the same time, this release and letting go is shaped by their aversion to mysticism, right? So at the same time, there's this cultural frame that says, no, we're not mystics. And in fact, we're just in relationship to one God. And it suggests a couple really interesting things. Partly, there were a few people who insisted when we were doing MRIs with them, and we would ask them this question, okay, who's in control, you or God? 1 is you, 10 is God. And most people would give an answer, 3, 5, 7, whatever. But there were several of our participants who every time would say 5, and they were like, this is just how it works. It's a shared process. And there's no full release and there's no full control. We're sharing it. And I thought that was a really interesting idea that they were using to shape their experience. And I'm curious, how does that shape the physiology of it? And one possibility, right? So if we're talking about merging with one sentient being versus dissolving into the ocean, or maybe we would call that like relational versus annihilational dissolution, right? There's some people thinking that way. If you look at the studies that suggest that ego dissolution involves DMN, default mode network deactivation, then you'd have to look at the studies of prayer that suggests that worshiping God involves theory of mind activation. And for those of you who are neuroscientists, right, you will recognize that the default mode network and the theory of mind networks are very, very much, I mean, they're almost the same. So we have two directions. One that is about a practice of release, that's about default mode deactivation, and another that's about the cultural frame of speaking to a sentient being, that's theory of mind activation, and they go in the opposite directions with the same parts of the body. And so I think it's sort of a beautiful example of like, okay, how does cultural shape our experience? The other piece that I think we're just beginning to figure out is the empowerment piece. So somehow at the end of this worship, people feel powerful. They feel, I mean, Pablo talked about feeling like an X-Man, and that we don't have, physiological evidence yet to show what that could be in the body. But we know is that they then go out and become activists in the world, right? That's just a common thing in churches that especially in the United States, people are speaking in tongues, feeling empowered by God, and then going out and knocking on doors, which is kind of an amazing story. There is one study, Amihai and Kozhevnikov, where they do look at Vajrayana meditation and show that it increases phasic attention, increases their arousal and capacity to think sharply with mental rotation tests and visual memory tests. So that's a really interesting question there. And then one other interesting question is that if you think of Andora's situation and you say, okay, wait a second, she's experiencing violence and she's dissociating as a way to survive. What's the difference between ego dissolution and dissociation in this thing? And is it just a similar experience with a differently valenced, differently valenced term? I know people are trying to figure this out, but it really hasn't been resolved. So set and setting is more than simply valence. I'm curious about the role of culture, expectation, and imagination in this. Time, how do we study consolidation and integration? Is the self healthy in certain contexts? Is creativity the result of the interaction between selves and their dissolution? What's the relationship between dissociation and self-transcendence? And does heat loosen? That's where I come. It's a whole bunch of questions. It's really fun for me. And I hope you've been intrigued a little bit. So let's see if people have questions to talk more directly about.
I've got a question, Josh. How did you come about this work? Like, how did you get interested in it and decide to research it?
So I probably figured out I'm not Christian. I'm a Jewish researcher. But for me, the interest first came actually in I've been organizing unions most of my life. And I was curious about the best organizers in the world, who are the Charismatic Christians in the United States. I mean, a group that can grow from 1,000 people to 500 million in 100 years is incredibly adept at building community. And I was curious what was going on there. Turns out that a big piece of it is what they do with their bodies, right? A big piece of it is the way they do mind-body training, the way they develop their capacities to have these experiences together. That's part of what develops their capacity for organizing. And so I started studying that. And, just in the last 2 years, I guess not 2 years, in the last 4 years, we really got into the neurophysiology of it and started to really realize we could put people in the MRI and look at their brains and think about it in that way. But that hadn't really seemed possible beforehand. Anytime we said it to somebody, they're like, that's not going to work. There's going to be too much movement. There's going to be too much it's going to be unclear what the object of study is, and those are really good fair questions, but it turns out that we can study it.
So were those things that you had to overcome, were there obstacles with like scanning people in MRIs and things, like practical problems with them moving and things like that, or did it kind of work? I mean, obviously it worked in some way, but
And it worked to some degree, and we should have that should be out in the next couple months. But the because we're staring at these little, those little colored pictures right now and trying to figure out exactly what happened. But uh the it was very difficult. It was difficult first in that there were evangelicals who are like, this is not a church. What are we supposed to do here? And but luckily, the first person who went in the MRI, she loved it. She was like, this is amazing. It's like a noisy, uncomfortable, awkward situation, which is perfect for praying to God. Like it's the perfect place to be like, God, I need help. This is really hard. Um, and she had an amazing experience and came out and started prophesying over our research assistant who happened to be really happy about that. So the getting people to do it was one of the challenges, and then the movement question was one of the challenges. And it turns out that people can speak in tongues and fully experience God even when they're whispering. They don't need to be moving, and I mean, because that's part of it's done in big groups sometimes and it's really loud and has a lot of movement, but people also do it at home really quietly to themselves. And so we were dealing with experts, like people really highly skilled who could go into that state on their own without a whole church around them. So
and
so the question of sort of like ecological validity and movement, those both resolved themselves, and it was really great.
okay. Yeah, and one other thing you mentioned about the sort of 70s research, and it sounded like it was kind of slating a lot of these practices. Did you face like challenges in getting people to agree to participate because of sort of stigma around how things have been handled in the past in terms of research?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, so I've been studying speaking in tongues for 18 years, as an anthropologist. And like in this particular church that most of our people came from, I'd been there for 6 years. So they knew me, right? We had done a whole bunch of interviews together. They knew that I wasn't a Christian, but that I was, kind to them and I wasn't trying to debunk. I mean, one of the things that's really important, and that's kind of a new thing in the evangelical world now, is that they've come to the idea, at least, that God's going to work through bodies, right? So we have our bodies, and I can say, here's how a body works, right? But for them, that can be God's creation. Neuroscience can be God's way of working our brains out. And that took a bit of work, right? That's taken probably decades for that concept to be okay and for them to be like, yeah, of course, God works through bodies. So we can study bodies and we're just studying what God creates. But that was not the evangelical idea, 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Great. Do we have any questions from
Yeah, I
anybody?
just had a quick question back to on methods, like the earlier part we were talking about. Um, Josh, has there been how much work has been done in similar sort of protocol, studying similar things, but with EEG or electrophysiology? Um,
So there hasn't been, I mean, so the history of speaking in tongues research, there was like I think 2006, a SPECT scan with 6 people, 6 subjects. Uh, and then there's been a couple studies that were looking at white and gray brain matter in experienced tongue speakers. But that's it. We have an EEG study planned for this summer. So we're going to do a dyad study where people pray together and then pray apart and pray together and pray apart. So we can do the hyperscanning synchrony stuff, but also get deeper into what actually is the neurophysiology of speaking in tongues.
Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's super fun, actually.
Anybody else?
I'm curious, I guess, in all of your work, does, and maybe nobody has an answer to this, but to me, the big thing that I think we're figuring out is that there's these really different sets of expectations that people go into these experiences with, and they clearly shape the brain. And so do they shape our way, do they shape our ways out? Do we have examples of that? And I think speaking in tongues is a really good model for that. That allows us to think, okay, we have an experience that makes you feel powerful, right? I mean, so when I've talked to some of the people that I've interviewed, they use the metaphor from Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility, because what we have is we have people loosening their brains and becoming sort of capable in ways that they never felt before. Like they feel able to do all sorts of stuff. They can go up in front of a church and make a speech. They can go down to their neighborhood and like make arguments about how to change the world in the ways they want to. And that's beautiful, right? That's sort of a gorgeous empowering of human beings. And yet the setting could set them off to be like, okay, our what we're empowered to do now is to make sure that there's no more immigrants in the United States and that we build big walls, right? Or it could be that we really love each other in the church and we love each other outside of the church. So I think it's really intriguing to think that, and then think that against the psychedelic, or with the psychedelic renaissance, think that with meditation, the mindfulness, sort of explosion of mindfulness, and say, okay, how do we put those things together? What are the contexts that we're shaping these things in? And it's not just the immediate kindness, it's a whole set of ideas and thoughts about how the world should work that really gets integrated into these experiences. Looks like Will has another question.
Oh, no, I was just saying that that's really, really fascinating stuff. It kind of reminds me of, I mean, like transcendental experiences like this can have a lot of like a wide range of outcomes, like ideologically, depending on what social context you're in. And it really reminds me of Leo Roseman's work, trying to use ayahuasca in Israeli and Palestinian populations. And yeah, I guess like kind of what I think is, yeah, like exactly what you said. Like it really, the effects of these things really, really depends, right? People don't just necessarily become, you know, like the direction you move in after having transcendental experience is not monolithic, right? It's many different ways it could go depending on who you are and what context you had that experience in.
Yeah, the two researchers I work most closely with are Michael Lifshitz at McGill and Tanya Lerman at Stanford. A big piece of their focus is imagination, and they're really interested in how the imagination shapes experience, and they want it to be, and it's an interesting thing because in a lot of Buddhist stories, the goal is to get rid of imagination, right? The goal is to empty the mind and to clear your futures and your pasts. And Tanya and Michael have both argued pretty strongly that that's one thing, but that also imagination is a really powerful tool that we can use in all sorts of ways. And so part of what, if you believe in God, then you think that charismatics are talking to a God, and that's affecting how their brain's working. But if you think of it as imagination as well, it's also a powerful tool. Either way, it becomes something that really matters in the way these things work. That there's a particular individual that they're speaking to directly, and that's part of the altered state. Looks like Christian's got a question.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Christian. I'm from Peru. I found the event on Facebook. It was nice to hear you, Professor. My question is about what is the best way if you want to study ego-dissolution, maybe for a research. Maybe in the case of some indigenous communities, for example. What do you think about that, Professor Josh?
When you say the best way, what do you mean by that?
Is there any, I think maybe like a technique, or maybe how can you contact with the people with a different culture? For example, in Peru, there are different Amazonian communities that uses plants like ayahuasca or other type of plants. But I know that ego dissolution is a specific topic that are research. But in your point of view, what is the best way for study that?
See, I think I'm not sure what I'll give you two answers. One is that there's nothing that's like trust. Trust is like the foundation for good research. And that takes time, right? It means you actually have to be trustworthy and kind, and then take time with people, because the dangers of the work that I do, and it sounds like the dangers of the work that you're thinking of doing, or maybe that you do already, they're kind of big, right? Because if you go into communities and you're not paying attention to what they want and what they care about, and you're just thinking your own thoughts, and not listening very closely, you can really hurt people's feelings, but you can also hurt people. And especially in the Amazon, there's all sorts of risks of big money. If you suddenly find a group of people who are really good at ego dissolution, then it's going to become a tourist place, and then it's going to be run with like Western white people coming and going, oh, this is great, I'm going to dissolve my ego while I destroy your community. And so I think it's pretty delicate and requires you to be in it for the long haul and really be committed to be caring about that community, and not just the ways they do ego dissolution. So if that's what you mean by the best way, that's the thing that strikes me. I mean, there's also tools, like you can study the sense of dissolution with scales and with neurophysiologies and all that kind of stuff. But I think those are way less important than thinking about the community and caring for them. I mean, in the end, we're trying to care for people. So that's our work. And it needs to be the beginning and the end of it, the way I think about it anyways. Sorry if that was...
We've got a thumbs up for that.
Good.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good.
Thanks for joining us. Did you say you're joining us from Peru, Christian?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
wow.
Yes, I'm a psychology student here in a public university in the
Oh,
north.
fantastic.
Yeah.
That's very cool that you've joined us. Great.
Yeah, good to meet you. I'd be happy to talk to you more about it if there's, if you want to think concretely about it. But it really, like for me, and we'll see how people who are evangelicals take this research, right? I mean, but it took me, a decade before I was even willing to talk to people about it. I mean, before I really had the idea, but also it was just, I knew them well enough to say, is this something interesting to you, right? Are you interested in the physiology of what you're doing? And a bunch of folks are like, yeah, I'm really curious. Like, what is happening? And is it material? Is it, can you see it in the brain? And what will we learn about ourselves? And what will we learn about like our relationship to other people? And it's been really important for me to keep the truth that, yeah, maybe it looks like psychedelics, maybe it's a little different than psychedelics, maybe it looks really different, have those questions there, but then keep the truth that their cultural experience and their experience of what they experience as God is the key for them. And that's how it works for the people that I've spent time with.
Josh, please do by all means send us links to your paper on this. And you mentioned that you're awaiting the results on some of the MRI stuff, because I can put the links in the description on the YouTube video so people can have a look.
I will do that. It's going to take a little while for that to be
that's cool.
Right in the process. It's like last week we were looking at the brain stuff and trying to think about it in relationship to the different states, and there's absolutely something going on, but it's not completely clear how it fits. And then given the real big diversity of research on psychedelics and meditation, we're gonna have to see how we can fit it into that story.